All right, you guys, greetings from Omaha. I've been in Omaha for a couple weeks and I've been doing a lot of reading, really enjoying this vacation. So today I wanted to give you a little bit of the highlights of this book, The Sensuous Lie, which was written in the 80s and I find just as relevant today. It is out of print, so I bought this from a book reseller on Amazon. And this is one of my go-to books that I really recommend. It really expanded my awareness of sex, and the way that we think of sex today, if you put it in the historical context, has a lot of downsides where we think of sex as like performance, or if you don't come this way or come often enough or have sex often enough, there's something wrong with you. And this isn't always how people thought about sex, but how did we get to this point? So she starts out in this book talking about the expert, the sexual researcher, starting with Kinsey. Before Kinsey, and I mean, you can go further and further back through history, but let's just start in the Victorian era. The sex drive was bad and constraints were necessary. And then Kinsey came along to try to kind of change all that with his research. Now remember, he was a data nerd. I think he was the one that was studying the gall wasps. Like, he was like a geek and a data nerd, and he applied that same methodology to sex. He thought the sex drive was good and constraints were evil, and as a data guy, he was measuring things. But he wasn't so interested in the right way to have sex. He was trying to measure it, and he found a great range in human behavior that he found fascinating. But his unit of measurement, and you have to have a metric, was the orgasm. So in measuring male orgasms, and he was counting them, people have often misinterpreted his work, but in actuality, he meant his statistics to show the enormous difference between individuals. But yet, his statistical averages were used to advise the individual upon his or her sexual conduct, unfortunately. So then, but remember at the time, the public was still, a little bit leery about all the sex stuff. So his focus on statistics was probably really good for that time. But remember, his unit of measurement was the orgasm, and males more reliably had orgasms during sex than women did. Then next came along Masters and Johnson, and they studied and measured physical sexual responses of men and women in great detail in the laboratory setting. And they also came up with the idea that there was a correct and an incorrect way to have sex. Now, this was a new idea, supposedly, and that sex was not just a matter of morals, but a matter of health and sickness. Actually, so Masters looked around for women who would be willing to volunteer for a sex laboratory, and since he wanted to measure, there was this idea that women needed to climax from intercourse, and so his subjects were women that reliably climaxed from intercourse. So he wasn't looking at all women. All women, volunteers, had to be able to have orgasm from sexual intercourse, and in particular, orgasms produced by the penis thrusting in the vagina. So sexually speaking, these men and women, particularly the women, were super fit. They were middle-aged, educated, mostly in their 20s and 30s, and mostly married or formerly married. So he didn't test all women. He tested a certain subset of women. And people were very interested to know, what is a proper female climax? So Masters and Johnson believed they discovered the real female orgasm. And again, it has to do with laying down rules for sex. These rules are about the body. It holds that performance matters. Another interesting thing about Masters and Johnson, as I said before, is that they took sex into healthcare. So now it is a discipline that is treated by doctors. So it's not just a moral thing anymore, although it can be, but it's also a healthcare issue. That if you don't have the right number of orgasms and so on, you need therapy, you need healthcare. So this is very interesting to me because it was kind of like we haven't always thought of sex that way. In fact, in the last chapter, she talks about celibacy and how there's so many aspects of human behavior and such a range of sexuality that people have, that some people are perfectly happy being celibate. They find their meaning in other things, and that some marriages are happy being celibate. Like, not everybody loves sex, and to not everyone is sex so important as it is probably to me because I make videos about it, and maybe to you guys because you watch my videos. But there are other things that are more important to other people. It could be gardening, it could be their vocation, their spiritual life, their family life, their work, their cooking, other aspects of life, and that we're not just made of sex, and that we don't have to judge ourselves as being, if I don't have sex in this certain way, there's something wrong with me. So that's a lot what I got out of the first chapter, and I really am summarizing. Now, even before these experts came out, now she talks about the marriage manuals. So even starting in the 1920s, there were marriage manuals written for couples about how you should have sex. So while Dr. Alfred Kinsey was still working on gall wasps, there was a book published in 1926 called Ideal Marriage. Now, before Ideal Marriage came along, marriage was really done for survival, for convenience, for having children. It was an economic unit. I think we forget that. I think that's why so many people are single today, because they don't need to have a partner for economic security. But back then they did. Marriage was an economic unit, binding families together, producing heirs for the continuation of name, and providing a livelihood for women. Those in search of sexual thrills looked outside marriage. For men, this meant a brothel, a discreetly kept mistress, or a liaison with a married woman of his own class. For women, love outside marriage was thought unsuitable until at least one and preferably two male heirs had been produced, and then a woman in search of sexual thrills would have been expected to take a lover. But marriage was just for economic reasons. And when Ideal Marriage came along, it was one of the first unashamed books on sexual technique for ordinary married people, written by a Dutch doctor, Dr. Theodore van de Velde. And so the idea was that sexual pleasure was necessary in marriage. It was possible for any married couple. In fact, it was recommended. In fact, it was a crucial ingredient of married happiness. Anyway, you can read this chapter. So it goes on, but then the idea kind of became that women were insatiable, they were capable of multiple orgasms, simultaneous orgasms as the goal. And if you're not having simultaneous orgasms every time, and many of them, what is wrong with you? You need a manual, you need health care, you need therapy. And so sex became this performance thing against which a lot of people judge themselves. And that's really a lot what I got out of this book, because I myself had suffered from that myself. The author of this book, one of the reasons she wrote this book is because she suffered with that herself as well. And if you read my book, The Fuck List, F-CK, Fuck List, available on Amazon, I write in there about my own insecurities and perceived inadequacies that came from the society at large, not from how I necessarily felt. In fact, I can enjoy sex very much without having an orgasm at all, contrary to what the manuals say. Sometimes I want one and sometimes I don't. Sometimes men want one, often they do, but sometimes they don't. So this whole idea of performance and women like, oh, am I squirting? How do I look? Am I having enough orgasms? It's this very outward focused thing instead of focusing on our pleasure and how we're actually feeling. But that's what was going on from all of the researchers and the books. And people are making money off this stuff, whether they actually believe it or they just see it as a way to make money. It is a big money maker, telling people about their sexual inadequacies and how they can experience more pleasure. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but there's a wide range of what people can enjoy. There isn't like, and the other interesting thing that came out of this book too is that just because, and I know this from being around spiritual people in the meditating community, I think that the way to evaluate ourselves, if you wish, is like, how satisfied am I with my life? How good do I feel inside? Not, because people can chase multiple orgasms or they can chase squirting. And I mean, those things can be fun, just like how many weights can I lift, how fast can I run? It can be fun. But if we use that as a way of measuring our competency, our value, our normality, that's getting way off the point. Because some people run faster than me, but I don't think there's something wrong with me. Some people can taste the different notes in a glass of wine. I can't, but I can still enjoy the wine. But when it comes to sex, we've I think, and I especially too, have labeled ourselves as being inadequate as compared to some norm. Whereas I can't taste the bouquet in different wines, but I'm okay with that. So I think we have to be okay with just enjoying it. Again, what I meant to say in my book, when I wrote my book, there were a couple decisions I had to make about my authenticity. One was I going to admit my Vicodin addiction? And I decided yes. My last video is about that if you want to check that out. And the other decision I had to make was I going to admit to the world the most embarrassing secret I had, which was I do not orgasm from penetration. I have enjoyed it very much. I do enjoy it. However, I don't orgasm from it. And I spent 30 or 20 or 30 years of my life thinking there was something wrong with me because of what I read in books or what I saw fake acted in porn. And while there are women who do orgasm from penetration, and some of them are my friends, or who have energy orgasms and all kinds of different orgasms, I want to compare it again to like spirituality or exercising. There are people who have really great spiritual experiences. They feel Kundalini energy, or they see auras, or they see, have divine visions, or had God experiences. And then, but does it make their life any better? Because you can get caught up chasing that over and over. But also, just because a woman has multiple orgasms and squirts, or someone saw deities or auras, it doesn't mean that they're any happier or their life is any better. So, like they say in meditation, like Maharishi always said, we don't meditate for the experiences, although they're nice. We meditate for the results we get in our daily life. So kind of like that with exercise too. Like, I love challenging myself in the exercise. It's super fun, and I do it for my enjoyment. Like, I was at Orange Theory yesterday, and it's super fun, and most people wear like these heart rate monitors, and you're supposed to see in your range where you are, and a lot of gyms have mirrors so you can watch yourself. But what I've learned from Pilates is no mirrors, proprioception, just feel inside your body. And I don't want a heart rate monitor because I'm going by how I feel. And so let's just take the pressure off of sex. Let's take the pressure off all of that and be like, how do I feel? Why am I having sex? How do I feel? What do I enjoy? And if with another person, how am I connecting with that person? What is our experience? And being present. So that's a lot of what I got out of this book. Here, I'm going to read this. At first, sex had been officially acknowledged only in the marriage bed, and the marriage manuals had to justify their erotic content by maintaining that good sex was necessary for a good relationship. That justification was then no longer needed, and simultaneously the market had expanded to include singles, adult marrieds, adolescents, adults, the elderly, the middle-aged. Peak sexual performance was the new goal. Money could be made from it. The result was a rash of sex manuals, which in turn were to stimulate the need for sexual performance. It was a marketing manager's dream. Between the 1960s and 1970s, sex manuals galore were everywhere, selling thousands of copies. Sex was universally acknowledged to be fun, democratic fun for everybody. Now, before you heard me read 1960s and 1970s, you might have thought we were talking about a book written yesterday. That's what I mean. This book is just as relevant today as it was then. Even while they proclaimed the virtues of sex as fun, they felt the need to offer more books. In books, mainly for women, this was often a promise of a life-changing experience, a born-again feeling, not too far from the personality changes of religious conversion. The implication was that the right kind of sex would lead to a new life. In books mainly for men, this message was less popular. Books for men had a more worldly slant, and it still is, in my opinion. It wasn't so much the experience of sex that was stressed as the mastery. These books promised a new status for the reader. The sexual response became less important. It was their competence that was important. And then, you really have to read this book. I've underlined so much in preparation for making this video, and it would just be a 2-hour long video, which I can't do, but let's see how long it goes. So in popular fiction, the heroines are marked by their responsiveness. So women are supposed to be so responsive, and we're also sold this myth of this very responsive woman, right? They have incredible orgasms. The heroes are unbelievably competent, usually in a way that conveys strength and dominance rather than gentleness. So here she has a little section from a book called The Betsy by Harold Robbins. He placed his hands under her armpits and raised her naked out of her shoes and held her high in the air over him. Slowly he began to lower her on him. It was as if a giant shaft of white-hot steel were penetrating her vitals. She began to moan as it opened her and climbed higher into her body, past her womb, past her stomach, under her heart, up into her throat. Then the author, it surely is some penis. Let's continue. As if she were weightless, he crossed the room with her wrapped around him, then suddenly threw her from him onto the bed. She began to climax almost before he was fully inside her. Then she couldn't stop them, one coming rapidly after the other, as he slammed into her with the force of the giant body presses she had seen working in his factory on a tour just the day before. And finally, when orgasm after orgasm had racked her body into a searing sheet of flame and she could bear no more, she cried out. Then all his weight seemed to fall in on her, crushing the breath from her body, and she felt the hot, unrushing gusher of his semen turning her insides into viscous, flowing lava. After all this, she murmurs, as well she might, "C'est pas possible." In fiction, even virgins melt into amazing orgasms, and of course men rape them with total competence. And then she has another passage. And then nothing prepares the adolescent for the fact that this doesn't happen in real life. And then, of course, the advertisements, reinforce the message about, you know, all the wonderful things that happen if you use the right perfume. Against this promise of nomadic bliss, what chance has the boy next door or the nice girl he meets at the disco? Against the great lovers of fiction and the beautiful people in magazines, we cannot compete. Reality cannot live up to such expectations. I can still remember my own reaction to lovemaking. It was not a lost pleasure, it was shock. It wasn't like the books had promised. I had been expecting, perhaps not overwhelming pleasure, but at the very least a surge of feeling and sensation that would blot out what was happening. I expected to be caught up in lovemaking and carried away. It seemed so down to earth. There were legs and arms and bed covers all tangled up and not enough heating, nor did anything seem different afterwards. I didn't feel fulfilled or womanly. I didn't look different. I checked in a mirror about this. I was in no way transformed. Instead, I was worried. Surely it wasn't meant to be like this. And I can agree to that. I think that we're sold this myth of, if we have sex the right way and if we're responsive enough, if we're sexual enough and responsive enough and orgasmic enough and competent enough and know all the techniques enough, it's going to be this fabulous experience. But don't get me wrong. I have experienced sex that took me into a trance, into another world. That kind of sex is pretty rare. It does happen, but it's not every time, for sure. It's pretty rare, and I think it can happen in certain relationships you have with certain people that you have a great passion for. And I think that the more that we actually feel our own pleasure, rather than being performance-oriented, the closer we can get there. And certain people make it easier, but it's not necessarily the thing that they build it up to be, especially not every time. Then she talks about the sensuous woman that rocketed to success in the 70s. I remember that, when she was like, greet your man wrapped in saran wrap at the door. And it was all about, if you're not sexual enough, then we can teach you to be more sensual. Anyway, so it was all about telling people, about performance. The accent was on performance. Performance begins with the individual. And that women who didn't have orgasms were just not doing it right. They sometimes said they enjoyed sex without orgasms. Me too. But that was nonsense. That's like saying that you enjoy dinner without swallowing it. So women should devote their energies to solving the problem. And this was something that they started really, selling to women. Then, the idea that the sex research is based towards noticing activity, not inactivity. And, there are people who are very happily married and they're not having sex at all. I don't know how common that is. But here's another thing about orgasms I want to mention is that what she writes about. And again, I have had sex. It's been rare, but I have had it, especially when I was married, the last years of my marriage. When I felt all this passion for my husband, I would be like lost in another world. It's pretty hard to get there other times, but I have had men that were like extremely sensual with me where I got lost in another world, but they have to know what they're doing. And I think I would agree with most women that it's like 2 or 3% of the men. I don't know, but as she writes here, when it comes to orgasm, and when I had those really intense moments, it wasn't from an orgasm. It was about how turned on they made me and how I got lost in my own inner world. How I just submitted or surrendered to them. Some of the most intense lovemaking moments in my life have been those in which I did not get an orgasm. Arousal. Mounting arousal without orgasm can be madly exciting. I really want to highlight this point because I have said for a long time that for me, sex isn't about orgasms. It's about the journey, the adventure. What can I feel? What can I discover? How turned on can I get? What's going to happen next? And that for me is so true. And I was really delighted to hear her say that, but I've never heard anyone say that before. That just getting turned on is so much fun and so fulfilling. I want to say something else about a trans state. I have a very popular page on Just for Fans. I don't give out the link to it or anything. If you are a subscriber to Just for Fans, you can look through the models and try to find me. I use a different name and all that, but I made a video yesterday, like a 20-minute video for my Just for Fans. You don't have to watch it, but I'll tell you the concept for it was how men imagine that women masturbate versus how we actually masturbate, because people are so, especially if we watch porn or something, right? It's so performance focused. So I made the first part of the video where I'm like writhing around and making all these sounds, this is how men imagine we masturbate. But how I actually do it, you don't see anything. I'm under the covers, you don't see anything moving, and I go into a trance-like state. Now, this video is not here to turn you on. I'm making this video for women. You don't have to writhe around. It's totally fine to just lay there and go inside, and that's what I need to be able to get really turned on. I have to really focus on myself and go inside myself. I think this book made me more aware of that's what I do and that's what I like, but that's not what we're taught is like sexy or hot or erotic. But there are studies, brain studies, that show when women climax, certain parts of our brain shut down. Women, as opposed to men, we have more parts of our brain is like more active, like thinking about what needs to be done. That's why you want to get the woman away from home and the kids if you want her to be sexual with you, for you married guys. But you want the woman has to be relaxed and shut everything out more than the man. And in order to climax, we have to shut everything out. We can't worry about someone walking in or you making a move or doing something unexpected. It takes us out. So for us to feel our pleasure, and I'll speak for myself now, how I think women are, we have to be able to go inside ourselves, and we're not writhing and moving. We're just totally focused on, our pleasure. And probably that's how guys masturbate too. They're just moving their hand. They're not writhing around and making all these movements. And so there isn't really anything to see, and it can take a while. So I had fun making that video. I think the guys are going to like it, but it was such a contrast between, because in porn, what they do to sell you the porn, you can't smell anything, you can't taste anything, you can't feel anything. It's a visual medium. It's purely a visual medium. But sex isn't just a visual, it's an experience. It involves not just your eyes, but your touch, your what you're touching, what you're feeling, what you're smelling, what you're hearing. And honestly, I remember years ago I had some lesbian friends, and they said that the one woman was like, when you're doing all this stuff to me and I'm just totally quiet, it's because I'm enjoying it. And the other woman was like, but I want to see you making sounds and being excited. And the woman who was like more the submissive one was like, but I am enjoying it. When I'm totally quiet, that's when I can enjoy it the most. So ladies, I want to give you permission to, these are the things I got out of this book that no one ever talks about, that you have the most pleasure when you're making the least movements, the least sounds, because you're going within. And there will be times you make sounds, but a sound is not proof of pleasure. Sometimes being totally quiet and being totally still is the proof of pleasure, if you want to prove it to someone. So I think we have to get away from expecting people to move or look a certain way. Or, we have to have these results or this performance or these visuals. And it's like, well, how do I feel? What do I desire? What do I want to ask for? What is it that I don't want? Those kinds of things. That's what I think this book really is good. And yes, you can enjoy sex without the orgasms. Let's continue. Sexual climaxes do not always coincide with loving or passionate feelings, whatever popular literature may say. The heroine of today has to have her monster orgasm from her lover to show that it is really love. It is a literary convention. Just as villains must have their comeuppance, heroines must have their orgasm. She came with a shudder that shook her whole body and released another scream from her that scarcely seemed human. But in the real world, orgasms do not always mark love. Not all orgasms are wanted orgasms, whatever the sex manuals imply. When my first marriage was breaking up, I had what was for me a week of intensely exciting sex with my husband. My body ran counter to my emotions and betrayed me nightly. It hastened the moment when I left home more effectively than all the roads. And then women talk about being sexually responsive even when they didn't want to be. Anyway, I think this book is really good. I highly recommend that you check it out. The chapter on celibacy is very, very interesting. I think I would like to go into that a little bit. The existence of people dedicated to celibacy is living proof that the sexual appetite is not absolutely like hunger. Celibates do not starve to death from lack of orgasms. But they do have to live in opposition to the culture all around them. They, not the sexual freedom enthusiasts, are the true nonconformists. So if you want to be a nonconformist, you be a celibate, because the people going around humping all the time are now the conformists. I found this a very interesting twist. This was written in the 80s, by the way. We are in a society that no longer gives any secular value to chastity and that largely disputes its religious value. So if you think you're going to be like a counterculturalist or like a rebel, go celibate. That's what the rebels do. I found that interesting. Leaving aside, now there have always been lots of, celibates in the religious community. In the reign of Henry VIII in England, there were 645 monasteries. Leaving aside religious celibates, there were also many people at other times in history who lived without marriage. Think about households that had colonies of servants. Ladies' maids, housekeepers, a footman or a butler. Journeymen who lived in the houses of their employers. The extended family in middle-class households often accommodated maiden aunts, cousins, and occasional bachelor uncles. So it's not like we've never had celibates, but are they as unhappy as we think? There are some people who are very unhappy with their celibacy, but there are other people who are not. They like their celibacy. So I think we need to also discuss that. There are many people who find pleasure in other things, and they find that, unlike food which we need and air that we need, when they stop paying attention to sex, it becomes less and less important and they lose their desire for it. Not everyone, but there are a group of people for whom this is true. They stop having sex or they stop masturbating, and then pretty soon they forget all about it. We react to situations according to the meaning they have for us. This becomes evident from the experience of voluntary celibates. The deprivation experienced the deprivation experienced by the unwilling celibates becomes in the voluntary celibate a positive advantage because they're no longer ruled by their sexuality and needing sex and being dissatisfied by sex. They find a sort of inner peace by no longer chasing sex. I found all this very interesting. What effect celibacy has on emotional health is difficult to decide. I have an impression that celibacy does not necessarily involve tortures or frustration. Many celibates adapt quite well to sexual activity if they decide to give up their religious lives. The behaviorist theory that the sex organs must be kept in constant practice seems rather exaggerated. A survey of former nuns and priests showed that most of them became sexually active when they left their religious life. So this whole idea of use it or lose it does not necessarily hold true. The reason when they asked priests and nuns why they left, none of them mentioned sex or celibacy as a reason. The most reasons that they gave was that they had no autonomy, that they were kind of bossed around and lost their freedom. And then loneliness, so a lack of power. And then loneliness was another big problem. Because after, especially in the evening, people naturally feel kind of lonely for companionship, not necessarily sex. Now, finally, we are more than just sex. Okay, judge me by my sex life alone, and you do not have the whole of me. I could probably tell you my sexual secrets far more easily than I could tell you the secrets of my own spiritual life. All around me are people doing things that I find remarkable. Reading books, playing the piano, typing without mistakes, playing football, juggling figures, studying the life of the steep-home snail, selling useless goods, discovering God, having babies, planning and ending, turning from despair back to hope in life, trying to put brotherly love into action. Their genitals are not very fascinating in comparison with the rest of their lives. We also need to question how useful sexual behavior is as a guide to diagnosing mental disorders, because people with mental disorders can have a lot of orgasms, and people who are emotionally healthy may not have any. She also talks about how there's a link between sexual activity and personality, that introverts are easily aroused and they tend to avoid strong stimulation, while extroverts have more difficulty being aroused, so they're constantly searching out stimulation. Now, it is not just what people do in bed, it is also how they feel about it. Okay, are they happy or unhappy? Guilty or free from guilt? Satisfied or unsatisfied? That's what throws light on their personality. Kinsey's simple formulations of a lot of sex versus a little sexual activity start to seem less and less helpful. As a diagnostic tool, orgasm counting is of limited value. Now, perhaps psychiatrists should ask us more often about love. Love seems to be a better key for understanding people and also for sorting out many of the troubles in our society. Having the right orgasms isn't going to make people become mentally healthy, reduce the number of broken marriages, or make individuals happy. Loving ourselves and others just might. When I use the word love, I realize I'm using an inexact term. I don't mean possessive love, falling in love, romance, or even partner-to-partner love. I'm referring to loving kindness. Love is not an irrelevant part of our sex lives. Rather than asking how often and with whom we had our orgasms, it might be better also to ask how we felt about it, what it means to us, and so forth. But sexologists seem to hate all mention of love. They pretend it is not measurable because quite often they haven't even tried to measure it. And this is where I think loving kindness is so important when it comes to how we treat other people and how we treat sexually in bed. Being empathetic, being kind, honoring boundaries, noticing how somebody else feels, and also how we feel being kind for ourselves. The old moralists used to think that genitals mattered a great deal. They laid down rules about what could be done down there, defining penis-vagina contact as good, while other forms of orgasms were evil. I suppose you could say that by limiting the kind of genital activity available, the best moralists hope to encourage virtues like loyalty, heterosexual love, brotherly love, and love of God. The liberators seem to have the same obsession with genitals. By getting the genital contact just right, Masters and Johnson hope to encourage love between men and women. Indeed, there's a trend toward suggesting that love can only be found in genital contact. Love without sex is no longer respectable. Family life has diminished and family love contracted in scope. It is now respectable to put granny in a home, and many people don't even know who their cousins are. Unmarried relations have to live alone, no longer invited into a family. Children leave home before marriage. The nuclear family is one man and one woman with their children, and that is all. Friendships even are socially rather suspect. Today, David and Jonathan would be put down as a couple of closet gays who lack the courage to come out. In a society that already suffers from lovelessness, it seems odd to encourage loveless sex. We have cast away many of the traditional areas in which people found love. Big families, close working relationships, churches, neighbors. And so these no longer exist to provide the love that sex may not provide. Now, what is the answer? Now she finishes this book. What is the answer? In my own life, I've had a few insights that helped me. One is that I had to stop believing that there was a magic ingredient for happiness, the Santa Claus effect. When this and this happens, then I'll be happy. I began to wonder if love of friends, my husband, family, even perhaps of a God, might not be a better pursuit than the pursuit of sex. Learning to practice loving kindness has helped me a little. Perhaps making sex less important and love more important might help society. The other insight that I've had and try very hard not to lose is that we don't all follow the same path. I don't quite understand why one man's joyful celibacy is another's despairing deprivation. We need less, not more sexual rules. And then that was pretty much the end of the book, if you want to get this book. This was a really long video, but I think I got the main points, and I got so much out of this book. That's why I wanted to share it with you guys. And thank you so much for watching my video.